Hello and welcome. My name is Joanna and I am a criminologist, frontline practitioner and author of the book Children and Teenagers Who Set Fires, Why They Do It and How to Help. In my 17 years of working with children and teenagers who set fires, whether that's working directly with families or training and supervising staff who also work with children where there are real concerns about their behaviour, a massive part of my role is to understand what is being communicated when a fire is set. And so I've been asked to explore with you today the general principle of behaviour as communication by children and teenagers, particularly in times of stress. All that in 30 minutes. We could sit here for 30 days and still have questions to ask and areas that remain unanswered. And so in 30 minutes, I will do my absolute best to talk through with you general principles about this work and how we respond. And so the first most fundamental principle to remember is, of course, that all behaviour is communication, regardless of age, regardless of our emotional state. So let's imagine we were in the classroom together having this discussion, or even better, in a cafe or pub, much more relaxed than behind a screen. If when talking to you, you didn't make or maintain eye contact, that's behaviour you are communicating to me. I have a choice to think about whether you find eye contact difficult, perhaps it feels too intrusive, or maybe there's even a cultural context where to maintain eye contact, especially child to adult, could be seen as aggressive or even rude. Perhaps you'd be doodling in the classroom, and again I have a choice as to how I interpret that behaviour. Do I see you as distracted and not very interested? Or do I think actually the very act of doodling takes away other distractions and so allows you to concentrate better? You're less distracted. And then, God forbid, you yawn. Maybe you're yawning right now. We're not even 5 minutes in yet. It's going to be a long 30 minutes. Again, how do I interpret that communicated behaviour? Do I think you're not really interested, you're bored, you don't want to be here? Or do I maybe wonder that you're tired and what the reasons for that might be? And perhaps you're one of those children or young people or adults who just can't keep still, that you fidget all the time. And again, do I see that as, well, you don't want to be here, do you? You're not very interested. Or do I wonder if maybe, is it really physically uncomfortable for you to sit still? Or perhaps you're feeling really stressed and anxious, and that's what your behaviour is communicating to me. So all behaviour is communication. And notice that all those behaviours had a way to be interpreted. It depends on the lens we look through. And you're going to hear me use that phrase a lot, because it really does depend on the lens we look through as to how we understand behaviour and how we interpret it. All those behaviours had a choice of, do I see the person as insolent, bored, disrespectful, not interested? Descriptions we often hear about our children and young people because of their very behaviours. Or did I wonder, okay, what is it that makes sitting and listening difficult? Why is potentially eye contact uncomfortable? So embedded in this general principle of all behaviour is communication is also the consideration of what lens do we apply to look at this behaviour and seek to understand it. And let's think about the child who's fidgeting. Is that coming from a place of stress or anxiety? Stress in its most basic form is the body's response to pressure from a single event or life events. The Mental Health Foundation defines stress as the degree to which we are unable to cope with pressures that are unmanageable, that feeling of being overwhelmed. Well, as we sit here in 2020, it's hard to imagine anyone who hasn't felt that way at some point this year. Feeling utterly overwhelmed, unable to cope with, quite frankly, things that are indeed unmanageable. But there's almost a risk there that we become blasé about it. Oh, the year of COVID-19, the corona crisis. Are you a corona kid? When actually we need to remind ourselves what's it like to be the child, what's it like to be the teenager who's lived through COVID-19. So let's pause and think, what has that actually meant for our children and teenagers? What has it meant for many of us as adults? There's been a loss of social contact, all the more acutely felt potentially by our teenagers at a time in their development when peer relationships really matter. What has that sense of isolation done to their feelings of being overwhelmed and unable to cope? What has schooling looked like? Were you homeschooled? Or were you one of the children who was still able to go to school? Oh, are you one of the vulnerable children? You're not going to stand out at all, are you? Or are you there because you're a child of a key worker, the heroes, when actually you know that your parents are as vulnerable as anyone else, doing heroic work, but don't have shields of heroicism that protect them from the realities of COVID-19. And especially if you're a child from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic family, your stress, your worry, your anxiety around COVID-19 might be all the more heightened because you know you and your family are more at risk from the virus. On the front line, you are the very people that are more at risk from fatality. And so we wonder then why our children and teenagers right now are feeling stressed and how that is communicated. But that's only just the tip of the iceberg for our children and teenagers. Exam results, you're downgraded, you're upgraded, you're going to university, you're not getting your apprenticeship. This stress has the very real danger of becoming what child psychotherapist Betsy de Thierry describes as toxic stress. Pervading, pervasive, poisonous stress that affects our every being and absolutely affects our behaviour. Because maybe you are one of the children and teenagers who already lived a life of trauma and toxic stress. Domestic abuse. We know the levels of domestic abuse have risen during COVID-19. In one day alone, the calls to the domestic abuse helpline rose by 700%. Before lockdown, 4.2 million children lived in poverty. What does that look like now we are officially in a recession, when we know that young people are hardest hit in terms of access to services and job opportunities? And we haven't even contemplated yet that some of our children and teenagers, your very families, have been personally impacted by COVID-19 because of death. You are grieving. You are experiencing loss. How do we communicate that? Are we a family, a country, a society that is comfortable with talking about death, about grief? Do we equip our children and young people with the words, the understanding, the emotional vocabulary to express when life is difficult, frightening, scary, and I am overwhelmed? I would suggest that when we live in a society where we still hear phrases like, man up, that's so gay, don't cry, that we have a very long way to go in how we enable our children and teenagers to talk about feelings. They're encouraged to think about what they look like. Incessant, endless messages from one another, from social media, about how you look. Do you look good enough? What even that means. But how we think about our feelings and how we talk about our feelings, it's often non-existent for us as adults and certainly as children and teenagers. And so without the vocabulary to say how I am feeling, then we will use our behaviour to communicate. Because it takes strength and courage and the words to say to an adult, I'm worried about going back to school. I'm scared about stop and search. Our children and teenagers, some of them because of the colour of their skin, can directly relate to a man who was killed through a knee on his neck for nearly 9 minutes, and we talk about stress. This is societal stress and trauma. So how do children manoeuvre through life right now when they are potentially scared about school or the lack of it, home and the violent place that it is? Are our streets safe for all children, regardless of skin colour? Without the tools to talk through this, we will be seeing our children and young people talk about this through how they behave. And quite frankly, when you take that catalogue of stuff that has happened and is happening to our children and teenagers, then quite frankly, I'm surprised that more of them right now aren't rioting. And I don't say that lightly, I don't say it flippantly. It's a reference to the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who said, riot is the language of the unheard. That's on a societal level, the state level. So on that micro individual level, what is the language of our unheard children and teenagers? In my world, it's very much the use of fire to express. So let's think about that for a moment. Let's think of a very young child who sets fires. Now, what that young child is communicating is their curiosity. They're at an age in their development where they learn through doing. As adults, if we're interested in something, we ask questions. Oh, you were on holiday in Malta. What's that like? Where did you stay? How long were you there? But children, and the younger the child, they will find out by doing. There's the dog, they touch it, stroke it. No idea how dangerous that dog could potentially be. They taste things. They lick things. How worried we are right now about our very young children swallowing button batteries and washing liquid tabs for the washing machine, because at that age you taste it, you lick it, you swallow it. It's how we find out about the world around us. And you might wonder, why am I using the example of a child's curiosity being expressed through the playing of fire? That's not about stress. That's not problematic behaviour that we need to be concerned about. Well, actually, we still need to be really concerned about it, because our younger children are those most likely to die in the fires they set, because of course they don't know what to do in the event of a fire. They do the classic, I can't see it, it can't see me. They will hide under wardrobes, in wardrobes rather, and under beds. And so it's again about the lens that we look through. Do we dismiss behaviour as boys will be boys, oh, all children play with fire, or do we recognise this is still a worry, this is a concern, even if it's about curiosity and not using fire as a voice because life is painful and I don't have the words? We still ask the question about, well, how is this child able to set fires? It allows us again another lens to look through. Rather than thinking what's wrong with this child, There's nothing wrong with them at all. They're being curious. And if you're not curious when you're young, you can forget it when you're my age. So there's nothing wrong with this child. Perhaps it's more about the environment they're in. What's happening to this child? So there's another general principle for us to think about in our work or us as parents. All behaviour is communication. What lens are we applying to the behaviour? Is it about willfulness, destructiveness? Or are we going to employ empathy and understanding to wonder what might be communicating or being communicated? And that third principle of, well, is this something wrong with the child, or much rather, is this about what is happening to the child? So in all children's behaviour, we have the choice as the adults to wonder, for us ourselves to be curious about what is being communicated when behaviours cause a risk to that child, that teenager, or to someone else. And it's important to stress that seeking to understand a behaviour isn't minimising the seriousness of it. To have empathy isn't to say, oh, it's okay, you carry on setting fires, you carry on kicking your sibling, you carry on hiding under the desk in school. But it's to think, okay, what's it like to be the child, and why do they need to communicate in this way? And another lens we can adopt is thinking about choice. We often apply to our children and teenagers, they choose to behave in that way. Well, they threw the desk through the air, they told me to F off. Yet is there a choice? Because perhaps the stress hormones that prepare our body for survival have completely overtaken this child and teenager in that moment. So we started to think, what's going on in the brain? Now again, in 30 minutes, I'm not going to try and introduce neuroscience here. We'll never get off this screen. But it is important to think about, was this a choice of this child, or did their survival instinct take over because of the perceived threat through the stress response? And so what we are thinking of is our brain in survival mode, that a child is operating in their brain stem. In our evolution as a species, it's the part of the brain that evolved first, and when we are born, it's the only part of the brain that is fully developed because it's about survival. It controls heartbeat and breathing, going to the toilet. Just think of that function alone, of going to the toilet. What's it like when we're stressed and perhaps everything's contained? We can't go to the toilet. Physically carrying that bunged up feeling. What is that like? The physical effect on our bodies. Or the opposite, that I have no control over my toilet functions. It's also, of course, where fight, flight, freeze sits. There are other survival responses, but they are probably the three we are most familiar with and where many of our children and young people will be operating. They're not in the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, the thinking brain. They are in survival brain, to fight, to freeze, to flee. So, to freeze, the child that completely disassociates. I am disconnected in every way from thoughts, feelings, and the physical world around me, because that's the only way I know how to survive right now. Oh, I flee, I'm out that door. In that moment, I can't stay in this classroom. If I can't physically leave the classroom, I'm under the desk. I'm trying as best I can to be invisible, to hide, to flee. Or maybe I'm ready to fight. Come on. My adrenaline is pumped, and that's often the behaviour that frightens us. Children, teenagers who are aggressive, violent, destructive, defiant, rejecting, abusive, physically and verbally. That's a frightening place to be, as a parent, as a professional. And yet, if we are frightened, it's important to remember that the child and teenager acting in that way is as frightened. They are not able in that moment to self-soothe their fear, their anxiety, their anger. Whether that fear is perceived, real or imagined, the brain reacts in the same way, survival. And so when we sometimes think, I can't believe you did that, what were you thinking? Quite possibly that child in that moment wasn't thinking. They were in survival, fight, flight, freeze, whatever it took to exist. And yet, of course, we need more than existence for our children and teenagers and their families. And there's a real caution here about the word resilient. I sit in many meetings where I hear, oh, these children are very resilient. Are they resilient or are they surviving? And we all need more than surviving. We need to be able to thrive. And we can thrive, and we can repair, and we can have safe relationships and manage our stress and anxiety if someone teaches us how. If we can be that person who can sit with the anger, who can sit with the outrage. And this is why the horror of exclusion booths in our schools. What does that communicate to children and teenagers? When you are at your most frightened, when you are most in need of another human being, you will be stuck in a box effectively on your own. Work it out yourself. Where's the learning? Where's the regulation of emotion? Where is the empathy that sees this behaviour not as attention seeking, my most loathed expression in the world of children and teenagers, but as I say in my book, it is attachment seeking. Again, that change of our lens, that we see these behaviours as communicating the need for safe relationships, togetherness, connectedness. Are we able to be the parent, the professional that sits alongside a child in their most frightening of behaviours to teach them that they are okay, we are okay, and the world can indeed be okay when there's lots to be frightened of in the world right now. And so how do we begin to teach our children that they are okay, we are okay, and the world is okay, that they can regulate their stress, their anxiety, their fear? Well, we keep pecking away. And I don't mean pecking in the sense of you talk to them about the consequences of what they do, the danger of what they do. They've heard all that before. How many of us respond well to a lecture? Yeah, that really makes us feel understood, validated, heard and listened to. No, I mean pecking away in the sense of an acronym I've come up with, because we love an acronym, don't we? In the professional world, if you're a parent, the power balance is often sat with the professionals because of their use of acronyms. Terminology we don't understand, we don't ask what it means. And so I'm going to introduce you, parents and professionals, to an acronym that you can take hold of and make your own. This isn't about a hierarchy of look at me and I'm so clever. This is about helping you hopefully remember that when you are beyond exhausted, when you are exasperated, when you're at your wit's end, frightened and as scared as the child and teenager in front of you, you're able, wherever possible, to take that moment and think, I need to keep pecking away. And so what is peck? It's patience. It's playfulness. Where is the joy in the world right now? Where is the humour and laughter in some of our children and teenagers' lives? So can we be playful? It's about empathy. Understanding again that general principle of asking what's it like to be this child in this moment when they're communicating through their behaviour, and generally in the world right now, in their life right now, what's it like to be that child, that teenager. We have consistency. The number of times I've been told, F right off, I ain't effing seeing you. Yet here I still am. I'm still sat on the settee waiting for them to come downstairs. Or if they never come downstairs, I leave the note that says, I'm sorry we didn't meet. I'll come again next week. And I come again next week. I am consistent. And I'm also consistent in my calmness, in my patience, in my playfulness, in my empathy. They don't do so many bad things and finally, right, that's it now, my empathy's run out. I am consistent in my empathy. And of course, care. We care for our children and teenagers, don't we? As parents, as professionals. So that's why we keep pecking away when they are communicating that life right now is difficult. I don't know what to do. I don't have the words. Patience, playfulness, empathy, consistency and care will teach our children and teenagers, oh yeah, Joanna's all right. I can talk to Joanna. Or Joanna listens and Joanna still turns up. And Joanna seemed to understand, even though on many levels I can't even begin to relate to some people's lives. And so, by listening to behaviour, by understanding what might be being communicated, we are able to give a voice to our children and teenagers, where it's no longer about the setting of fires, the throwing of goodness knows what through the air, the hitting of goodness knows who, but we are able to listen to behaviour, recognise it always as communication, ask what it's like to be the child, and to keep pecking away. Thank you for listening over our short time together. I hope I've been able to give you some insight into behaviour as communication, what stress is, how the brain responds to stress and the frightening behaviours we might see, and how best to respond. If you've any further questions, my email will be at the end of the conversation and you're able to contact me with any questions you have. But whatever your next steps, be you a parent, a professional, in the world right now, I wish that we can always go well. Thank you again for listening.